Howdy, gentlemen, and welcome to Mr. E's Classroom. Today we're continuing in part 2 of a two-part video about the early colonies in America. Last episode we talked a lot about the Virginia colony and the early settlement at Jamestown. In today's video we're going to pick up there and carry on with coverage of the Massachusetts colony and then a quick overview of some of the other American colonies. So, Massachusetts and New England. Or, well, really New England broadly. As we'll see, most of New England just branches out from Massachusetts. The Massachusetts experience is going to be pretty much the opposite of what we covered over in Virginia, both in motivation, social organization, and the rest. As we'll see, I think it creates sort of a nice dichotomy between the southern colonies represented by Virginia and some of the northern colonies represented by Massachusetts. With that framework in mind, we'll be able to understand the full spectrum of experience in the American colonies. As we mentioned in the last video, people will often mistake the events at Virginia and the events in Massachusetts for the same set of events. Massachusetts is a set of events that deals with the Mayflower landing and the Pilgrims. But within the Massachusetts experience, there's two sets of events that people also tend to confuse. So we're very familiar with the Mayflower landing, the Pilgrims coming to the New World and settling up their colony at Plymouth Rock. What a lot of people don't often recognize is that the Plymouth colony established by the Pilgrims and the Mayflower was only one colony in the Massachusetts area. The other colony that will end up being larger and dominate sort of the Massachusetts scene until both colonies are eventually fused into one is the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was set up in 1630, while the Mayflower colony, or the colony set up by those who came on the Mayflower, was set up 10 years earlier in 1620. Despite the fact that those took place in two separate times with two separate events, they were actually set up by the same set of people, who were Puritans. Puritans were a group of religious dissenters within England who were Protestants like most English people were, but who held a sort of very distinct Calvinistic set of religious beliefs. Because they were Calvinists, Puritans believed in predestination, the predestination of souls, which meant that effectively there were people in this earth who were already selected to be saved by the grace of God, and there were people who were destined for damnation. Like most Christians, they believed in an all-powerful God, but they took the sovereignty of God very seriously, and they viewed everything pretty much that happened in the world as a manifestation of God's will. On the other hand, they believed in the total depravity of human beings. They thought that human beings were totally fallen creatures who were ever prone to error and sin, which, while many Christians believe something similar, the Puritans believed this in a very intense sort of all-encompassing way. In the 1600s, the Puritans viewed England as a highly decadent society that was sort of corrupted by the evils of popery, which is what they called Catholicism, even though England wasn't actually Catholic. And what they hoped to do was sort of reform the English belief system, make it less decadent, more simplistic, and God-fearing in its composition. The English authorities under the King and the Church of England sought to persecute the Puritans to bring them in line with the mainline Church of England teachings. So what the Puritans would do very often is either practice their own way of doing Christianity in secret, or in some cases they'd flee to nearby foreign countries. So the Pilgrims who will actually come in the Mayflower left from Holland in the Netherlands and set up their venture that way because they were religious refugees who had taken refuge in Holland, a place that tolerated their Calvinistic beliefs. Which brings us to the general motivation for why Puritans came to settle in Massachusetts. The Puritans believed that if they could set up an ideal colony, an ideal society in the New World, then they could serve as an example to their home country of England. The purpose was not just to run away from the old world and start anew, but to actually be a shining example, a city on a hill, as they would call it, to persuade their Christian brethren back in the old country to sort of convert to a more puritanical understanding of Christianity. So when people say that the Pilgrims came to the New World in search of religious freedom, that's not quite accurate. Instead, what the Pilgrims really wanted was to set up a religious society where where their church, what came to be known as the Congregational Church, was the established authority. So the motivation to set up Massachusetts colonies, or the New England colonies, was religious in nature and not economically minded, as the Virginia colony was. So while the Plymouth colony was set up by Pilgrims leaving on the Mayflower, which we'll discuss a bit in class, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which would come to be the colony that has the town of Boston in it, which was much larger and overall more important than the Plymouth colony, was set up mostly by a guy named John Winthrop and his followers. John Winthrop was a Puritan leader in England who had an association of quite a few Puritans. What they did was they got together and they formed a company, but instead of it just being a joint stock company made for profit, it was more of a formal organization to pool resources to launch a settlement in the New World. Unlike the company that set up the Virginia colony, however, John Winthrop took the charter of the Massachusetts Bay Company with him to the New World. This meant that company organization and governance would all take place in the New World as opposed to in the Old World. That said, in a kind of confusing way, the Pilgrims in the New World were still English subjects, and they thought of themselves as such. Even the Pilgrims who set up the Plymouth colony, who left from Holland, declared in the Mayflower Compact that their sovereign was the King of England. But John Winthrop set sail in 1630 in what's known as the Winthrop Fleet. So whereas the Jamestown colony was set up by a couple of boats and the Plymouth colony was set up by one boat, the Mayflower, the Winthrop fleet consisted of about 11 to 16 ships carrying anywhere from 600 to 1,000 Puritans to the New World. That meant that when Massachusetts Bay was started, it was the largest English colonial venture in what would become the 13 colonies up until that point. Their goal, as I've said, was to set up a shining city on a hill. That's the term John Winthrop came up for it, to set a religious example to the rest of the English people. When they got there, they set up a republican form of government. Now, what I mean by that is that they had representative government of sort of elected representatives who would fill offices like the governor and aldermen. Now, it wasn't a full democratic republic as we might come to expect in America. The only people who could vote were people who were in good standing or full members of the Congregationalist Church. That meant that the religious organization and the ministers of the church held an enormous sway in the colony, and really at times it was difficult to tell whether it was a full-blown theocracy or a republic with just strong church influence. It was not some beacon of religious liberty. That was never the point. The goal for the settlers in Massachusetts Bay, for the Pilgrims generally, was to set up an ideal religious community that was in conformity with God's wishes, which they understood through the lens of their Puritan theology. That meant that moral laws were important, and maintaining God's will in a political state was the expectation. As we know from the story of Thanksgiving and Squanto and all that stuff in Plymouth, the Pilgrims were initially helped out mightily by the Indians there. In fact, when the Pilgrims first landed in Plymouth, that's not where they had intended to go. They had first intended to go towards Virginia, but they were blown off course in a storm, so had it not been for Indian aid, the first Pilgrims probably all would have died. But, as we know, Indian tribes were diverse in early America, as were European relations with the Indians. So while sometimes the Puritan settlers and the Indians got along well, other times there was enormous amounts of violence. At first, many Puritans sought to convert the local Indians over to their form of Christianity. What ended up being the general pattern was that the Puritans would expand their settlements into the sort of New England countryside and come into conflict with the Indians. The most violent conflict would actually come along maybe 40 years after the settlement in Massachusetts Bay would be King Philip's War. In that war, there is a very large outpouring of violence, and the Pilgrims, or the Puritan settlements, were almost completely destroyed at one point. But eventually they were able to turn the tide in the war and pretty much wipe out the local Indians. Some key facts that distinguish the Massachusetts settlements from their Virginian counterparts is that whenever the Puritans and Pilgrims came over, they usually did so as family units, so they brought women and children with them. Their goal was to have a full transplant to bring a new religious society to the New World. They were usually middle class as opposed to poor people in Virginia, which meant that widely they were very literate. Religion being so important, they wanted everyone to be able to read the Bible. And while church leaders and those sorts of people would hold a lot of political power in society, as a general rule, people would have a little more economic equality in the Massachusetts settlement, as opposed to Virginia, which would have sort of a planter aristocracy and then poor landless people below them. Now, the intense sort of religious fervor that had animated the first settlers would of course wane with the newer generations that would be born in the New World. As time would go on, the church would maintain an important presence in New England, but the religious mission would be less all-consuming. Increasingly, new generations would turn to economic pursuits, and farming or large-scale agriculture wasn't really an option for them because of the climate and terrain. So what the New England or the Massachusetts industry would tend to turn towards was shipping and trade, and also the lumber industry. Later, fishing and whaling would also be important industries for them. Completing the dissimilarity between the Virginia and the Massachusetts colonies, again, the Massachusetts colony was set on a very idealistic religious mission, not a profit-motivated one, however profit-motivated they might become in the future. What similarity they did have with the Virginia colony is that they would come to have quite a large amount of pride in their society and in their local government. They would have a fairly or a highly participatory form of government as compared to how things were back in England, and they would come to take a lot of pride in their perceived rights and privileges as Englishmen. So that'll pretty much conclude our broad overview of the settlement of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. For the rest of the video, we're just going to take a quick overview of the other American colonies as they were settled, so that you all have a good idea for what the sort of social landscape behind the 13 American colonies and their foundings was. Whenever people discuss the American colonies, they usually break them into 3 broad groups. This map here, which is very helpful for understanding the layout once things have gotten developed, breaks them into 4 groups. I'll explain that really quickly. So up in the north, the yellow colonies on the map are the New England colonies. The first New England colonies were Massachusetts and Plymouth, which eventually were just merged into Massachusetts colony. The rest of the sort of New England colonies, which would be things like New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, were all settled from offshoots from the original Massachusetts colony. Maine, in fact, originally belonged to Massachusetts itself. We've looked at how Massachusetts was set by very idealistic Puritans who wanted to set up a religious society. Well, as time went on, you had many other idealists who were uncomfortable living under what they viewed as a sort of stifling puritanical regime, and so they broke off to settle places like Rhode Island. Rhode Island, and Providence Plantations, as it was called, was set up by a minister named Roger Williams, who you may have heard of. Now, he had sort of a mission for a colony that was pretty tolerant as far as religious matters goes. And so if you want to look for a figure who established a tradition of religious toleration in America, you'd really want to look to Roger Williams in Rhode Island. New Hampshire, likewise, was settled by sort of Massachusetts separatists, and Connecticut was settled or broke off as a form of organization for people who were again originally part of Massachusetts, but then branched out and settled elsewhere. So the social landscape for all those colonies will eventually come to resemble sort of the same whole. People in New England live on smaller farm plots. Usually they're more middle class, better educated, and were originally there for strong religious purposes, but as time goes on, as we'll see, they become a little more normal, a little more economically minded. But throughout most of American history, you will find New England is a place with people with very strong moral ideals. We'll hop down now to the southern colonies. We've already talked about Virginia. In this map, they're broken into the Chesapeake colonies and then the lower South colonies. That does make sense for organization, but here we'll just talk about the southern colonies all as one unit. So the first was Virginia. One colony we should note right now is Maryland, which was actually settled as a refuge for Catholics by Lord Baltimore. That model or that dream really only lasted for about a generation. Very quickly, Protestants and Puritans in the area, especially as religious conflicts would break out in England, would take over the colony. And very quickly, it would basically become more like Virginia in its social layout. The Carolinas were settled by people very much of a mind of the Virginians. They saw the agricultural business that succeeded in Virginia, and they tried to do likewise in South Carolina and North Carolina. South Carolina especially is going to become sort of the southern model colony as far as relying on slave agriculture will be concerned. Georgia, the last of the 13 colonies to be settled in the 1730s by a man named George Oglethorpe, and named after King George of England at the time, like Maryland, would have sort of an interesting start. It was meant to be a refuge for debtors and former prisoners and the like. But again, very quickly, people from South Carolina moved in and turned it into just another southern agriculture-based colony. So in the end, the southern colonies are all going to look kind of the same, or roughly the same, with large agricultural sort of settlements as their mode. Very rural. You will have a planter aristocracy emerge that will be very wealthy, and then you'll have lower classes of whites with less land to no land, and also a large slave population, which we'll talk about more in class. Lastly, we have the middle colonies, places like New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey. These places were actually originally settled by the Dutch. In some case, the Swedes actually settled parts of New Jersey and Delaware. Those lands were taken from the Dutch in a war by the 1660s, I believe, and the lands were given out by the King of England to people he owed favors to, so the Duke of York, his younger brother, and a man named William Penn. So they were proprietary colonies. The reason I've left them for last is because the middle colonies end up kind of being a balance between the South and New England, which makes sense. They had a lot of farming in them, but their farmers were they were never quite as large as the large plantations of the South. They didn't grow things like tobacco or cotton. They focused more on grains. So actually the middle colonies will be the breadbasket of the colonies. Population-wise, they had the biggest mix of ethnicities. Now, when I say mix of ethnicities, I mean amongst Europeans. So there'll be Dutch people, there'll be Germans, some French immigrants as well from the Huguenots. But generally it's a middle-class society, and as time will go on, their economies will be the most balanced, mixed between sort of commerce and agriculture. Now, again, each colony has its own distinct history, its own distinct institutions, most of which are pretty interesting. I wish we could spend more time on it, but this should give you a broad overview of what the 13 colonies looked like up until around the early 1700s and how they all got started. So again, we have the New England colonies, which are all split offs from Massachusetts, Puritan origins, largely middle class, smaller family plots. The middle colonies, which are really just a social mix between the South and the North, sort of a balanced, moderate-sized pieces of land, some trade, some agriculture, and mixed populations as far as religion and ethnicity go. And then the South, which is overwhelmingly agriculture, mostly cash crops, slavery very prevalent, and a planting aristocracy. So with that, we have a good overview of the 13 colonies and how they were settled, and we'll be ready to dive into more material going into class.